He sat at the worst table in the restaurant, expecting nothing more than soup and silence. But when the waitress slipped him a folded napkin instead of the bill, his entire world shifted. Rain pushed in soft sheets against the tall windows, the kind of steady weather that turns a city quieter. Inside the dining room, voices rose and fell like a tide. Trays rattled. The kitchen door swung and clicked. A thin draft slipped through and found ankles. The table by that door was the last one anyone wanted. And that was where James Hartley Saturday. He asked for something simple. Tomato soup, a small green salad, warm bread, water with no lemon. He wanted to think, not to perform. He wanted heat in his hands and space in his head. No one here knew he owned half the block. The bakery with the good rye, the quiet bookstore. People saw only a tall man in a dark jacket. He liked it that way. He could listen without being asked for anything. The door breathed beside him. Stainless steel flashed. Pepper and garlic rode the air. A server whispered corner. The hinge squeaked and settled. The draft returned. He set his phone face down and slid it away from reach. The salad wore a shine. The bread gave steam to his fingers. He ate in very quiet bites and let the room speak. A teenage busser moved fast and steady, catching plates before they could clatter. The manager stood near the host stand, counting steps with his eyes. The waitress who had seated him moved like a person carrying two lives. She kept touching the pen behind her ear, as if counting her choices. She refilled waters with care that seemed larger than water. She stacked plates, like she was lifting weight off the room. When she reached James, she said, "Good evening," in a clear voice. She set down water before he asked. She wrote the order again. Soup, salad, bread, water, no onion, no lemon. He thanked her and watched her scan the room, the way people do when they know where pain hides. He wondered which table hurt her most. Outside, the rain tried to wash the city clean. Inside, the door kept swinging. Work and heat and effort passed inches from his shoulder. Honesty seemed to have a sound here. The clink of clean plate, the quick sorry when bodies touched. Tonight he wanted to hear it first. A tray brushed his sleeve. He apologized, though it was not his fault. The hinge sang its very small note. The draft curled again around his ankles. He did not mind. He had chosen this place for that sound and that breeze. They reminded him that comfort is not the same as being awake. He finished the soup and looked at the door as if it might speak. Steam faded from his glass. The watch on his wrist ticked. He did not check messages. He did not chase the next thing. He sat and let the worst table be what it was. A seat near a working door. A place where truth would have to pass close enough to touch. She comes back with water and a quiet face. No folder, no printer slip, only a folded linen napkin set where the bill should rest. The crease is sharp, the cloth white as a promise. Her hands are steady, her eyes are not. James thanks her, in the soft voice he uses when he wants to disappear. He lifts the napkin as if it were nothing. He feels starch and thread. He opens it and finds 4 small lines. Please do not react. Someone is watching. I need your help. The kitchen is not safe. The words hit harder than any figure he has signed, heavier than rent and payroll together, because numbers end at a total, and this asks for courage. He folds the cloth along the same crease and slides it under his water. He keeps breathing like a man tasting soup. He raises his eyes slowly, because the note told him to move like he had time. He sees the manager by the host stand studying screens. He sees a small camera over the bar aimed into the staff hall. He sees the waitress bring bread to a couple and miss her smile. The door beside him swings and breathes, pepper and heat. Plates sing. The room goes on with its rhythm. While his heart changes its step, he studies faces the way a pilot studies weather. He eats slowly to buy minutes. He lets the bread warm his fingers. He watches without staring. He measures the space between the manager's glances. He notices the dishwasher bell ring in odd bursts like a code. He catches the faint sting of bleach that should not travel this far. The waitress returns with water he did not ask for. The lemon floats like a tiny moon. Her voice says, "Let me know if you need anything." Her fingers touch the napkin edge to see that it is hidden. For a heartbeat, her eyes meet his and ask a question without sound. He nods as if agreeing about the soup, a small movement that says yes to everything else. He places a folded 20 near the bread basket. He wipes his mouth like a man getting ready for coffee. He lifts the glass and finds a second slip beneath, smaller than a receipt, a torn corner from a prep list, with 3 words, "Back door, 5 minutes." He leaves his chair with the slow scrape of someone who will return. He walks toward the restrooms like a guest with a call to take. He passes the host stand and offers the manager a friendly nothing. He washes his hands and stares at a face that could refuse. The napkin in his pocket feels warm. He steps into the hall behind the bar. Staff flow around him. He counts to 20. He listens to clatter settle. He pushes metal bar and opens the alley door. Rain touches his forehead. He breathes once and steps out to meet whatever asked for help. The alley light flickered and hummed. The air smelled of rain and wet cardboard. James leaned against the brick and waited. Footsteps, quick but controlled, came behind him, and there she was, the waitress who had given him a napkin instead of a bill. She carried herself like someone who had been pushed but had not yet fallen. Apron strings still tight, hair pinned in a rush, shoes damp from a floor that never stayed dry. Her name tag read Nora, but her eyes told him more than letters could. They were sharp with fear but steadied by habit, the kind of eyes that had learned to take the measure of a room in seconds. She held a glass of water in her hand, though she did not drink from it. She said she had not rung it up. She would not let him pay for it. Sometimes she gave water for free, to people who looked like they needed it more than food. Her voice was careful, trimmed of decoration. She had learned not to waste words, because words could be used against you. James told her he had read the note. She nodded once, the nod of someone who expected not to be believed, but had to try anyway. She said there were things she could not write down. Cameras saw too much. The wrong eyes read too fast. She asked for 5 minutes when her row of tables was finished. 5 minutes at the back door. 5 minutes of risk. He studied her posture. Shoulders squared, like a soldier still standing after a long night. Hands trembling only when she thought no one watched. She said her name was Nora Alvarez, 24 years old, 3 years at this restaurant. 5 before that spent in places that never kept her long because she asked questions, because she noticed things that managers wanted forgotten. She said she was not a troublemaker. She just did not know how to close her eyes when something was wrong. And this kitchen, this place, was wrong from the floor up. He asked her why she had come to him, a stranger, and she smiled without humor. She said she had seen him sit at the worst table in the house and not complain. She said he had eaten soup like it mattered. She said he looked like a man who listened even when he was quiet. She could not know who he was, but she knew he was not blind, and that was enough. She said the kitchen was hiding more than spoiled food. She said staff were being pushed to sign false sheets. Deliveries came in late with no labels. Cash went out in envelopes with no records. And anyone who spoke up lost hours until they quit. She said she could stand almost anything, but she would not let her younger brother eat food that could make him sick. And she would not lie to protect a man who laughed when workers begged for steady shifts. Rain tapped down in steady rhythm. A delivery truck groaned past the corner. James felt the weight of her words settle like stones in his chest. She had given him more truth in 5 minutes than most gave in years. He told her he would be there tomorrow. Same table, same time. And she exhaled, as if breath had been locked inside her ribs for months. Still standing, still ready, but now no longer alone. The dining room moved with the rhythm of plates and voices. But James was no longer listening to the clatter of forks or the rise and fall of conversations. His eyes kept drifting toward the host stand where the manager stood, one hand always near the monitor, his gaze sliding back to the screens again and again, too often for a man simply keeping order. James lifted his glass, took slow sips. and let the moment stretch as though he were in no hurry. But behind the calm his mind was counting every tilt of the manager's head, every flicker of movement across the grainy screens, every shadow he studied too long. When the check was offered, James declined with a gentle shake. He had already paid in exact cash, a habit that left no trail. He rose from his chair with the deliberate ease of someone who had eaten too much bread. He put on no coat, though it waited on the rack, and he walked not to the main door where the rain still pressed against glass, but to the narrow side hall, a place where bus carts rattled and bleach lingered in the air. His steps made little sound on the scuffed floor. He pressed the bar of the side door and stepped out into the night. The alley light above hummed like a broken wire, flickering against brick and asphalt. Steam lifted from a grate with the smell of iron and old water. The rain had softened, but the air still carried dampness that touched his skin like a warning. James leaned back against the cold wall and waited. The door pushed open again, and Nora stepped out. Apron still knotted at her waist. Strands of hair stuck to her face from heat and sweat. Her hands rubbed at her forearms as if she carried more chill than the weather alone could give. She looked at him once, checking not for recognition but for resolve, then pointed upward toward the roofline. "New cameras," she said, her voice low and certain. "Not for safety, for silence." James followed her finger. He saw the faint red glow of a lens tucked where the drainpipe bent, invisible to anyone not searching. The angle aimed not at doors or delivery trucks, but at the narrow space where employees stepped to breathe, the place where whispers were supposed to be free. He understood the cruelty of it. A space meant for relief turned into a trap for fear. Nora crossed her arms and leaned against the opposite wall, her body still in the uniform of service, but her eyes speaking with the clarity of someone who had run out of time. She explained how the cameras had multiplied after staff began to ask questions, how the angles were placed not on the cash drawers or exits, but on their break spots, their back halls, even the freezer door where people argued about shorted deliveries. James listened and saw it all forming, a pattern drawn by someone who wanted control, not safety, someone who wanted to know who whispered and who stayed quiet. He asked her how long she had noticed. She said from the first night the hum of the alley light was joined by a sharper buzz, a frequency that made the air prickle. She had followed the sound and seen the tiny diode flash against the brick. The steam lifted thicker from the grate, wrapping their words. The night pressed in, and James felt the truth settle heavier than rain. He told her he believed her, no hesitation, no condition, and she closed her eyes just for a second, as if to let that belief sink in before she could lose it. Then she straightened, still standing, apron tied, and said tomorrow she would show him more. The rain had slowed to a mist that clung to the air, soft enough to sound like silence, yet heavy enough to chill. James stood with his back against the brick, listening, while Nora kept her eyes on the ground, as if the words she carried might break if she looked at him too long. She said she needed to tell him everything, because once spoken, it would not belong only to her. It would not be able to hide anymore. She began with the labels, how boxes of meat arrived with dates long past safe, how the manager peeled stickers and replaced them with new ones printed in the office, how no one dared question, because questions led to fewer shifts. She said customers praised the cuts as tender, but no one saw what she scraped off the pans at night, the gray edges trimmed away so plates could shine in the dining room. She went on, her voice steady though her hands shook. She described how food left on plates came back through the kitchen and was carefully cleaned. Meat returned to trays to be reheated, sauces mixed back into stock pots, the cycle hidden under the name of efficiency. She said she had refused once to serve a dish she knew had been recycled, and the manager called her into the office and told her she had made him lose money, told her she could make it right by signing a sheet that said she had thrown bleach down the drains and scrubbed floors she had never touched. Fake cleanings were logged after midnight, every corner checked off with a pen, but never a mop. the health reports stacked in the office like a shield of lies. James stayed silent, letting her spill each detail like water she had been holding back too long. She said the lies did not stop with food. They seeped into the paychecks too. Uniform fees deducted for aprons they never received, break minutes shaved off time cards, tips rerouted by a small handheld device that blinked when no one was looking. Each dollar meant for the servers diverted into a pocket that already had too much. She took out her phone, cracked screen lit with 2 photos, one of a small blue inhaler resting on a counter beside a folded note from a doctor, the other of a rent notice stamped with red. She said her younger brother could not wait for air the way managers could wait for profits, and she could not wait for mercy from landlords who had none. She said every dollar stolen was a pill not bought. Every lie she signed was a night she lay awake, counting what she did not have. Her eyes lifted then, brown and fierce, and she told him she would not lie on the health sheet again, no matter what it cost, no matter if her job vanished with the signature she refused to give. She said honesty on minimum wage was a gamble you almost always lost, but she would not gamble with her brother's lungs or her own name. James felt the weight of her words, heavier than the storm, and he knew they were not just confession, they were a vow. The alley was quiet except for the hum of the flickering light and the drip of rain sliding down from the roof. James leaned against the wall and watched Nora hold herself upright, as though standing was an act of defiance. She had just finished telling him truths that cost her more than any shift of labor, truths that could take away the roof over her brother's head, and he felt something inside him loosen that had been locked tight for years. In that moment a memory rose, as sharp and gentle as the smell of ground coffee, his mother's small handwriting curling across the side of a recipe card she had kept by the kettle. Work clean, choose kind. He had carried that phrase like a stone in his pocket since the day she died. Not heavy enough to bow his shoulders, but always there. A reminder when deals grew sharp or boardrooms grew cold. He could almost hear the scrape of her pen and see the way she dotted her I's, like she was planting seeds. He thought of her kitchen, nothing grand, just 4 chairs and a chipped mug she used every morning. She would pour coffee and tell him that the world ran on money but lived on trust. She would say, if your work isn't clean and your heart isn't kind, then no amount of success will make you whole. And she would tap his hand when he tried to argue, reminding him that cleverness without honesty was only another kind of theft. Now he looked at the young woman standing in the rain, soaked alley with her apron still tied, and he saw how hard she fought just to keep her dignity while holding together her brother's health and her own hope, and the band of iron around his chest gave way. For months he had walked through his life like a man carrying more wealth than he could count, but less warmth than he could admit. Tonight, her courage pierced him more than any business risk or market loss ever had. He told her thank you, not with the careless tone of a man accustomed to being served, but with the weight of someone who understood what it meant to hand another person to your last piece of trust. Thank you for speaking. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for trusting a stranger who is not a stranger at all. His voice was low but steady, and she blinked as if those simple words had caught her by surprise. For the first time since they had stepped into the night, she smiled, small but real, the kind of smile that comes when a burden lifts just enough for air to reach the lungs. James felt his mother's phrase again, work clean, choose kind, and he realized that the note tucked into his pocket was not just a cry for help, it was a chance for him to choose the same. He nodded once, a vow made silent but sure, and the alley seemed less cold. James stepped back inside with the dampness of the alley still clinging to his jacket. The dining room had thinned, but the hum of voices lingered. Forks tapped, the kitchen door swung and sighed. He returned to his table as though nothing had shifted, though everything had. He called for the bill even though the napkin in his pocket weighed heavier than any receipt, and when the slip arrived, he laid down exact cash, bills and coins counted carefully until the total matched to the cent, not a fraction above, not a fraction below. No tip touched the line of the paper. His pen left it blank. Yet as Nora leaned close, he pressed a folded 20 into her palm. Her fingers closed around it fast and discreet. Her eyes flicked once in thanks before she turned away. James leaned back in his chair as if he were tired, but his eyes stayed sharp on the screen, mounted beneath the bar. A small monitor, where the cash drawer showed in grainy detail, meant for security, now an open window into a different truth. He watched as the manager moved toward it. Casual, practiced, the way men do when they believe no one is paying attention. The drawer slid open with a ding, the bills lifted, his fingers danced quick and sure, and then the movement slowed as he pulled another slip from his pocket. With a pen he marked something, adjusted numbers in neat strokes, and closed the drawer again with a small, satisfied push. It was theft, disguised as arithmetic, smooth and silent, the kind that would never raise alarm bells, because the totals always added up. James could see the method in it, the way skimming was disguised as correction, the way cash flowed like a river diverted by a hidden trench. To most eyes, the manager was simply keeping order, protecting margins, ensuring staff followed rules. But here, in this corner with soup bowls and crumpled napkins, James saw the truth. Nora passed once more with a tray balanced high, her shoulders steady under weight, her glance quick toward the monitor, then away. She had seen it all before, he realized. She had lived with the knowledge that her labor was being sliced thin by a pen stroke, that every coin she earned could vanish in a correction she never made. He felt the memory of his mother's words press hard again. Work clean, choose kind. And he wondered how long it had been since anyone had said them in this place. The hum of the alley light still echoed in his ears, the heat of the soup still faint in his chest. But now a sharper heat stirred, the kind that comes when silence no longer feels like an option. He saw how easily the theft slipped into the rhythm of the restaurant, how dishonesty had been woven so tightly into the math that numbers themselves became accomplices. He picked up his coat this time, smoothed it across his arm, and as he left the table, he looked once more at the monitor and thought, "Tonight, I saw the cost of silence. Tomorrow, I will decide how much it is worth to break it." The restaurant was dark when James returned, only a few lights glowing above the bar, and the faint hiss of the refrigeration units humming in the back. The hour when a place that bustled with voices and footsteps becomes hollow, when walls echo with the labor of machines rather than people. He had given a reason when asked why he wanted to stop by. Calm and ordinary. Just a businessman curious about his accounts, a man who liked to see details after hours. His voice even enough to convince the manager to leave a key with the night staff. He stepped in with his phone in hand, its lens disguised as casual but ready to scan what paper and numbers might not reveal. He moved through the aisles with the quiet ease of someone who had walked kitchens before, and already the cracks began to show. Inventory codes on the shelves glowed faint and mismatched under his scan. Numbers stamped on boxes did not align with delivery logs filed in the system. The same carton of beef logged twice, the same sack of flour noted on 2 separate dates. Profits made not from sales, but from ghosts. He turned to the cleaning log pinned against the corkboard near the prep station. Neat signatures lined up in tidy rows, bleach listed on every shift, corners scrubbed, drains flushed, health codes met with perfection. Yet he knew this could not be true. The building had been closed 2 Sundays past for a power outage. He remembered seeing the dark windows when he walked by. And yet, the log for that day was signed off, with bleach poured and surfaces wiped. He lifted his phone and scanned the sheet, saving the false record as proof. The night dishwasher shuffled nearby. A young man with tired shoulders, sleeves wet from hours of steam, his eyes cautious when James asked simple questions, his voice low when he answered. He said most nights he kept his head down, most nights he did not see much, but sometimes deliveries came late. Boxes marked only with tape, never to be opened, pushed straight into storage. He motioned toward the corner where a heavy plastic bin sat sealed tight with bands, marked with a bold black cross. His voice grew smaller when he added, "They told me never open it, not once, not ever." James crouched by the bin, his hand resting on the cool plastic, his phone camera ready. He pulled at the seal and felt resistance, the kind of resistance meant to make a worker hesitate and walk away. He did not. The seal snapped, the lid creaked open, and a smell rolled out that was not just food, but something sharper, chemical and wrong. A mixture of rot, hidden beneath the sharp bite of bleach, poured to cover it. Inside lay packages of meat darkened beyond use, scraps that should have been destroyed, stored instead to be trimmed, relabeled, and sold again as fresh. The dishwasher turned his head and muttered a prayer under his breath. James closed the lid, his chest heavy, his phone already storing the images. This was the ledger that was not books, not neat rows of numbers or tidy signatures, but the record of choices made in shadows, choices that turned hunger into danger, choices that measured profit in sickness. He stood, his jaw set, and knew the line had been crossed too far for silence to remain. The hall smelled of bleach and old coffee, the kind of mix that clings to walls long after the night crew leaves. James had just finished taking the last photo when he heard footsteps that moved too steady to belong to a dishwasher. He turned and saw the manager standing broad across the narrow hall, arms folded, a smile on his face that carried no warmth, the kind of smile used when someone wants you to feel small. His jaw was set tight, hard as the edge of a counter, and his voice came soft, almost friendly, but with edges that cut. He called Nora clumsy, as if dropping a tray or spilling a glass could explain the truth that had been written on logs and hidden in sealed bins. He said she should be grateful she had work at all. He reminded James that plenty of people lined up for jobs that paid in tips and leftovers. He spoke like a man, rehearsing the lines he used on staff to keep them quiet. James did not answer. He simply watched, the way he would in a boardroom when someone mistook arrogance for strength. But inside his chest, the weight of anger pressed harder with each word. The manager leaned on the wall, tilting his head just enough to seem casual. His voice dropped lower, smoother. He said accidents happen in kitchens. Knives slip, grease pops. A hand reaches into hot water too fast. Sometimes people forget to look before they step. Sometimes those accidents happen to the people who make too much noise. He smiled again, as if describing something ordinary, but his eyes stayed fixed, like nails driven into wood. James let silence stretch, and in that space the manager stepped closer, pressing a finger against the time clock on the wall, tapping it lightly, then dragging his fingertip across the buttons, slow, deliberate, like he was stroking the leash of a dog. He said, "Schedules are fragile. They vanish with a single keystroke. Hours can be cut without reason. Weeks can go empty. And anyone who complains finds themselves erased from the roster as if they never existed." He tapped the clock once more, hard enough to echo. Nora had walked into the hall during this, tray empty, apron marked with flour. Her eyes widened, but she did not stop. She stepped past James as if she were nothing more than another worker moving through the night. But James caught the tightness in her jaw, the way her hand clenched at her side. She had heard every word. The manager glanced at her and chuckled, called her lucky again, said not everyone gets a second chance when they stumble. And his laugh was thin and sharp, like a blade dragged across glass. James did not speak until the manager was finished. He simply studied the man's face, the way he would study a contract, line by line, searching for the hidden trap. He gave no reaction, no sign of fear, only calm that came from knowing the truth was already captured in his phone, in his memory, in the sealed bin he had opened with his own hands. The manager's voice had been meant to frighten, but what it did instead was sharpen James's resolve. As the manager walked away, confident he had reminded them who held the leash, James looked at Nora and nodded once, steady and sure, a silent promise that threats whispered in quiet halls would not be the final word. The restaurant was dark again, the alley quiet. But James did not leave after the threat in the hall. He sat in his car with the rain dripping off the windshield and felt the weight of everything Nora had given him. Every lie written in a ledger that wasn't books. Every bruise left in words that pretended to be friendly. Midnight passed. The streets emptied. And James took out his phone and began calling the few people who still carried his trust without needing to ask for it. The first call went to Arthur, his COO, a man who had built the company with him from long nights and cheap coffee, a man who knew numbers like other people knew faces, who remembered names of employees in departments James had not visited in years. Arthur's voice came sharp but steady, even after midnight. He asked no questions about why, only said where, and James told him to bring patience and a notebook. The second call went to Evelyn, his lawyer, a woman who had made a career out of prevention rather than courtroom drama, who liked clean contracts more than messy battles, who told clients to stop problems before they became headlines. She answered with the crisp tone of someone who never truly slept, and when James explained, brief and careful, she said she would bring fresh files, a clean pen, and enough resolve to face whatever rot he had uncovered. The last call was the most delicate. He scrolled until he found the number of a city inspector, not the kind who traded signatures for envelopes, but the rare kind whose badge still meant something, who had once told James over coffee that the city only stayed upright because a few people refused to bend. James spoke quietly, not asking for favors, but for honesty. He asked him to come before sunrise, to bring clipboards that had not been touched by lies, to bring eyes that could see what managers tried to hide. By the time he hung up, the rain had slowed to mist again. His car ticked with cooling metal, and James felt less alone. The night still pressed heavy, but now there were others walking toward it. He leaned back in his seat and thought about the size of the task. A small team in a big room, a few honest hands against a system built to protect itself. But he also thought about the look on Nora's face when she said she would not lie again. And that look carried more weight than threats or ledgers. The city slept while he planned. Delivery trucks whispered along empty streets. Neon signs blinked in puddles. And James imagined the moment just before dawn when his allies would gather in that dining room, tired, eyed but ready. He would show them the photos, the mismatched codes, the fake cleanings, the sealed bin. He would let them see with their own eyes, and he knew they would understand. For once the burden would not belong only to him or to a waitress with too much courage for her pay. It would belong to all of them, and together they would decide how to bring the truth into light. The sky was pale with the first light when the trucks hissed to a stop at the curb, brakes releasing a sigh into the empty street, dawn painting the wet pavement silver. James stood by the door with Arthur and Evelyn, both carrying clipboards, pens, and the kind of quiet focus that comes when people know they are stepping into something important. Behind them, the inspector adjusted his jacket, badge clipped to his belt, eyes sharp and unhurried, the kind of man who had seen excuses worn down to dust. The door swung open and the smell of coffee drifted out, and there was Nora, already moving through the dining room like a captain on deck, her apron tied tight, her shoulders square, carrying mugs that steamed in the cool air. She poured for everyone, even the inspector. Her hands steady now, her eyes bright, with something close to relief. She had not broken under the threat in the hall. She had only waited for this moment. The room shifted quickly from silence to activity. Arthur and Evelyn bent over logs, comparing delivery slips against shelves, their pens scratching like insects across the paper. James walked with the inspector through the kitchen, watching drains swabbed with sterile sticks, watching the color change on the pads that should have stayed clean, but instead bloomed with the unmistakable signs of neglect. Nora leaned on the counter, jotting notes when asked, translating the quiet language of the staff into the kind of detail inspectors could use. The dishwasher, the same young man who had whispered prayers in the corner, pointed again to the sealed bin, and this time the inspector himself cut the strap, peeled it back, and tested what lay inside. The result came quick. A fail printed bold on the strip. undeniable, and final. James felt the air shift in that moment, as if the truth had been waiting to be named. He turned toward the front, where Evelyn held up the pay logs and circled deductions that had no legal ground. Uniform fees repeated like a drumbeat across pages, tips marked as adjustments, and then the sharp ping of the handheld device that had been used to skim. Arthur had slid his phone past it, and the machine responded like it had been caught in the act, its screen flashing, the ping loud enough to draw stares. The manager appeared then, face open in a grin too wide, words tumbling fast about confusion, about procedures, about staff who must have misunderstood. But his eyes betrayed him, shifting, calculating, searching for a crack in the room where he could still escape. When James looked at him, calm and steady, the grin faltered, the jaw twitched, the shape of his face changed from control to panic. The inspector wrote notes in measured strokes, the sound of the pen louder than the hum of the refrigeration units, and Nora, standing with the pot of coffee nearly empty, finally let herself exhale. The sting had been set with aprons and badges, and the truth, once hidden behind ledgers and smiles, stood plain in the morning light. The restaurant had fallen into a tense quiet. After the first round of checks, the manager tried to keep his smile, but it bent under its own weight. His voice offered coffee, explanations, promises of confusion to be cleared up later. Yet his hands fidgeted at his sides, betraying the calm he wished to project. James watched with a still face, his eyes moving past the gestures toward the narrow hall that led to the office. He had seen offices like it before, lined with framed certificates that looked impressive until you read the fine print. Awards given by small groups that sold recognition for a fee, plaques polished to look like proof of excellence. The door stood there at the end of the hall, quiet, waiting, and James felt the pull of it. The inspector was the one to move first. Walking slow, his notepad tucked beneath his arm, he reached the door and knocked, though he knew no one would answer, then turned the handle and pushed it open. Inside, the space was dim, lit by a single lamp, the walls crowded with frames, the desk stacked with papers that looked too neat, as though they had been arranged not for work but for show. Against the far wall stood a safe, its keypad glowing faint green, the kind sold in office supply stores, proud in its appearance, but cheap in its bones. James stepped inside with him, Arthur and Evelyn close behind, Nora hovering in the doorway, unwilling to breathe too loudly. The inspector gestured to the safe, his eyes meeting James's, a silent question hanging in the air. James did not hesitate. He nodded once, his jaw firm, the kind of nod that closed a deal, the kind that said, "Open it." The manager protested then, his voice louder, breaking the spell of the quiet. He said it was private. He said only payroll was kept there, nothing of concern, but his words tumbled too fast, and his feet did not cross the threshold to defend them. The keypad beeped as the inspector pressed, the code simple, predictable, the kind of numbers chosen by someone who never believed anyone would dare check. The door swung open, and the safe revealed not the neat stacks of payroll envelopes he had promised, but something heavier in truth. A ledger lay there, black cover, its pages filled with rows too tidy, each line written in a hand that believed order could mask crime. Fake vendors listed with names that meant nothing, ghost repairs for equipment that had never been broken, hours billed for workers who did not exist, and at the bottom of each page a column called breakage, the word that should have meant a chipped plate or a cracked glass, but here served as the slush line, the place where theft turned into math. Evelyn flipped the pages with careful fingers, her eyes scanning fast. Arthur stood behind her, muttering the patterns aloud. Numbers repeated, totals shifted, percentages that told a story clearer than any witness could. The inspector looked at James, his face grave, his head shaking once, as if to say the rot had run deeper than expected. James met his eyes and nodded again, this time sharper, decisive. The call went out from the inspector's phone, his voice steady as he requested backup, requested enforcement, requested that the evidence be taken into custody. Nora pressed her hand against the doorframe, her breath trembling, but her body still steady. She had lived this truth for years, but seeing it written in ink made it undeniable. James closed his eyes for a moment, hearing his mother's words again. Work clean, choose kind. And when he opened them, he knew there was no turning back. The back office door had opened, and with it the lies that lived inside could no longer hide. The morning stretched long inside the restaurant. The smell of coffee gone cold mixed with the sharp tang of disinfectant. Police moved in steady lines through the narrow halls, their voices calm but firm, pens scratching against forms, cameras flashing softly as evidence was catalogued and sealed. For once the noise did not come from clattering plates or swinging doors. It came from the sound of truth being written down, statements gathered and signed, each one heavier than the last. Nora stood near the back with her apron still tied, watching as one by one the staff were called forward, not just to hand over evidence but to speak words that had been buried under fear. The cook with the burned forearm came first, his skin marked from grease that had splattered when the fryer was overloaded, scars hidden beneath sleeves rolled high. He spoke in a low voice, almost ashamed, about how he had been told to ignore safety, to work faster, to accept pain as part of the job. He said he thought no one cared, that telling the truth would only bring laughter or dismissal. But now he looked at the officers and saw them writing every word, and his voice grew stronger. The dishwasher came next, his cap pulled low over his forehead, his shoulders hunched as if to make himself smaller. He mumbled about boxes he had been ordered to store unopened, about nights when trucks came late and orders were signed without checking. His words tangled until the officer asked gently for his name. He hesitated, fingers twisting at the brim of his cap, then lifted his head and said it out loud, clear and final. The name he had avoided using for months, the name he thought had been erased when he was told to keep quiet and keep moving. The silence after he spoke, it felt like air rushing into a room that had been sealed too long. Even Nora exhaled without realizing she had been holding her breath. James stood nearby, watching, listening, not as an owner or a businessman, but as a witness, each statement cutting deeper than any balance sheet or ledger, because here the cost was measured in people, not profits. He had built companies on numbers, on reports and audits, but this morning reminded him that behind every column lived names, lives, folded into shifts and schedules, stories written in burns and missed hours, in rent notices and inhalers. Nora was the last to sign, her hands shaking as she held the pen, her name written at the bottom of her statement like a small act of defiance, proof that she had refused silence. She looked up after handing it over, her eyes tired but steady, and for the first time since this began the room felt lighter, as though everyone inside had shared the burden that had weighed them down for too long. The officers closed their notebooks, evidence sealed in boxes, statements folded and stored. But what remained in the room was more than paper. It was the sound of people breathing freely again. Not numbers on a sheet, but names spoken and believed. And that made all the difference. The sun was high by the time the papers were signed and the doors locked, the dining room empty, except for the sound of pens and printers, a different kind of work filling the air. By noon, envelopes waited on the tables where customers once sat, each one marked with a name, each one holding not just money, but acknowledgement. The staff filed in quietly, unsure if this was another trick, but when they opened the checks and saw the figures, they realized the math had finally turned honest. Back pay for hours trimmed, overtime restored, deductions reversed, and for the first time in months their labor showed up in numbers that matched their sweat. On the corkboard near the kitchen door, a fresh sheet was pinned. The tip pool recalculated, line by line. Totals posted where everyone could see. No hidden adjustments. No skimming devices to rewrite the truth. Nora stood beside it with her arms folded, reading each name aloud like she was making a roll call. Her voice steady as staff stepped closer and nodded. Some with smiles, some with tears that slipped before they could be brushed away. For once no one had to whisper about what was missing. because nothing was missing. In the corner, James spoke with Arthur and Evelyn, the three of them finalizing the coverage for medical bills. The system they put in place was direct and without hoops. Invoices handed in and settled without forms, designed to humiliate. No begging, no pleading for signatures that never came. A cook handed over a stack of prescriptions with shaking hands. The dishwasher slid forward a paper for his brother's clinic visit. Nora placed the bill for her brother's inhaler, and each was accepted without question. The inspector, still present, leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, watching the change with the faintest smile, as if to say that this was what enforcement should mean. The kitchen stayed closed, locked for a week that stretched like a season. Orders canceled, and suppliers called. Apologies spoken over phones in voices that did not sound like excuses. Customers heard words that were not hollow but carried weight. Promises that safety and honesty were not slogans but commitments. And people listened because they could hear the difference. The dining room sat in sunlight that fell through tall windows. The empty chairs lined like witnesses. The silence less heavy now, more like rest. For the staff, the pause felt strange. The rhythm of clattering plates and swinging doors replaced by hours where they could breathe, where they could plan meals at home, visit doctors, sleep without alarms set too early. Some stood in the parking lot with checks still in hand, reading them again and again as if to make sure the numbers would not fade. Others called family, voices breaking as they explained that bills could finally be paid. Nora stayed until the last envelope was claimed, then leaned against the counter with her head bowed, sunlight catching on the edge of her name tag. James watched her, thinking of the note she had written on linen, 4 lines that had started all of this. In the end, restitution was not only in money, but in dignity returned, in a promise that no one would be forced to carry lies again. The boardroom was all glass and steel, polished wood that reflected light in sharp lines, the kind of place built to impress investors, not to hold confessions. James stood at the head of the table, the city skyline stretching wide behind him. But he was not looking at the view. He was looking at the objects he had carried in with his own hands. The black ledger sat in the center of the table, its cover plain but heavy with what it contained. Rows of lies written neatly enough to pass as order. Beside it lay the folded linen napkin, pressed flat. The note written in hurried letters, still faint in the fibers. Please don't react. Someone is watching. I need your help. The kitchen is not safe. The directors shifted in their chairs, accustomed to balance sheets and forecasts, not silence filled with weight. James cleared his throat and began to read, his voice steady at first, outlining the numbers he had seen in the ledger. Fake vendors, ghost repairs, breakage that was only theft, dressed as loss. Then he opened the napkin and read the 4 lines aloud. Words simple enough for a child, but sharp enough to cut through a fortress of denial. His voice caught halfway, breaking against the edge of the words, and when he tried to continue, it would not smooth out. The room waited, unused to seeing him stumble, and the sound of his breath filled the space. He pressed his palm against the table, steadying himself, then looked at every face around him. He told them they did not deserve the people they endangered with shortcuts, that every coin skimmed, every hour trimmed, every spoiled box passed along had been taken not from profits but from lives. He said a waitress with nothing but courage had risked her job to speak the truth when none of them had, and he admitted that it should have been him who saw first, not her. His eyes burned, and though he tried to keep his voice strong, a tear slid down, landing dark against the polished wood. No one moved. No one offered the polite coughs or diversions that usually filled uncomfortable pauses. He said plainly that they would earn people back, or they would not open again, that the company's name meant nothing if the people who carried it on their aprons were forced to lie to keep it standing. He reminded them that the ledger and the napkin together told a story that could not be ignored, one of theft and one of courage, and that only one of those deserved to shape their future. The directors looked at each other, some with shame, some with unease, but none dared to argue. James closed the ledger, smoothed the napkin with careful fingers, and told them the choice was not about profit, but about whether they would be remembered as builders or as thieves. His tears had left tracks down his face, but he did not wipe them away. He let them stay where everyone could see, proof that this time, nothing would be hidden. The work of rebuilding did not happen in one meeting or in one morning. It unfolded across weeks, across small choices that stacked into something stronger. James walked the halls of his company not as a figure to be admired, but as a man taking notes, listening more than speaking, determined that the changes would not live only in polished reports. Training was the first step, words rewritten until they were stripped of jargon, until any new worker could read them and know exactly what honesty required. No one had to guess what was right or fear that truth was hidden in fine print. The rules were plain and sharp as daylight. Audits became habits, not annual events announced with polished schedules, but surprise visits at odd hours, inspectors who appeared without warning, notebooks open, eyes clear. James told his directors that real accountability did not ask permission, it walked in uninvited, and though some shifted uncomfortably, they saw the sense in it. The first time an audit revealed a flaw, it was corrected before the day was done, and the word spread quickly through kitchens and offices alike. No one could bury mistakes anymore. The cameras stayed, but their purpose shifted. Lenses turned away from employees and toward exits, entrances, and storerooms. They guarded safety now, not silence, and staff noticed. Where once a lens in the corner made shoulders tense, now it reassured them that no one could slip out with stolen goods or slip in with harm. The difference was subtle but powerful, a reminder that watching can protect rather than control. The small handheld devices, once used to skim tips, were gathered up and removed, replaced with systems built transparent from the start, digital trails open for any employee to check, a pool recalculated daily and posted where everyone could see. When the first payout matched the hours and the smiles of the staff, the relief was visible, as if a weight had been lifted from the air. James insisted that the hotline be changed too. No more recorded voices or menus that led to nowhere. Now a human answered, gave their name first, and listened until the caller finished. Complaints were logged, tracked, and addressed, not shuffled into silence. Word spread that speaking up no longer meant losing shifts, it meant being heard. The final rule was the simplest of all, and James repeated it until it became second nature. If it would shame you on the front page, you do not do it. It was written on posters in break rooms, it was included in training manuals, it was said aloud in meetings until it became less of a slogan and more of a heartbeat. Workers quoted it to each other, sometimes as a joke, sometimes as a shield, but always with the knowledge that this time it was real. A house that had once hidden rot began to breathe differently. Light reached into corners where lies had lived. And James knew that though trust would take time to rebuild, the foundation now was cleaner, stronger, and true. The weeks that followed carried a different rhythm, quieter in some ways, stronger in others. The noise of fear replaced by the steadier sound of people working without the weight of lies pressing on their backs. When James asked Nora what recognition she wanted, she shook her head and said she had not spoken out for applause, she had spoken because silence was costing too much. She declined every spotlight offered. No speeches, no stage, no photographs with executives. What she asked for instead was a seat, a real one, not symbolic, and she was given it, the chair of the new employee council, with authority written into policy, and not just into promises. Her focus was simple: safety and wages, the two things most fragile and most easily bent, and now they had a voice that could not be ignored. She reported directly to the COO, and Arthur, who had known James long enough to see through posturing, treated her with respect from the first meeting. Her notes were clear, her questions sharper than many seasoned managers, and when she asked why something was done a certain way, no one dared brush her off. She carried her brother's inhaler in her bag sometimes, or left it on the shelf in their kitchen at home. A small blue reminder that every policy had a cost measured not in dollars but in breaths, a bell that kept them honest even when no one was looking. The restaurant itself changed in small but lasting ways. The table by the kitchen door, once the worst place in the house, was repaired. Its wobble gone, the draft sealed. It was not hidden away or replaced. It stayed where it had always been, not as a punishment, but as a reminder. Customers sometimes asked why that table carried a brass plaque with a simple inscription, "Honesty starts here," and the staff smiled when they explained that it was once the table no one wanted, until the right person sat there. Nora visited often, not in uniform anymore but still moving like she belonged, her brother sometimes beside her, his laughter spilling over the clatter of plates, his inhaler resting quietly in his pocket. The staff greeted her differently now, not as one of their own who had suffered in silence, but as one of their own who had given them a way forward. She still wiped down tables when she visited, habit too strong to abandon, but now it was choice, not necessity. James watched from a distance more often than he spoke, letting the systems work, letting the people grow into roles that had been waiting for them. He thought about the napkin folded in his desk drawer, the 4 lines that had started everything, and he knew this was what change looked like. Not grand announcements, but steady correction. Not punishment, but memory. The worst table in the house was no longer a place to avoid, it was a place to learn. And that was all the spotlight Nora ever asked for. The night of reopening carried a brightness that was not only in the polished floors and gleaming glass, but in the air itself. A lightness that came from people no longer hiding what they knew. The tables filled quickly, customers returning out of loyalty or curiosity, laughter mixing with the scent of fresh bread, the kitchen moving with the rhythm of a team that trusted one another again. James stepped inside quietly, without fanfare, wearing the same dark jacket he had worn the first night he sat at the worst table. And though the hostess recognized him, she said nothing more than welcome back, and guided him to the seat near the kitchen door. The chair no longer wobbled, the draft no longer reached his ankles, but the hum of the swinging door was still there, steady and honest, a sound of work, not of threat. He asked for the same water, no lemon, and the waitress smiled knowingly before leaving him alone with the simple act of waiting. Around him the room felt different, not because it had been repainted or rearranged, but because the weight that once pressed against every movement was gone. The staff moved quickly but not fearfully, their voices calm, their smiles real, and Nora stood near the counter, speaking with Arthur, her brother perched on a stool beside her, his small inhaler resting in plain sight on the wood. When the meal ended, James waited, as he had before, knowing the bill would come but not knowing what form it would take this time. The waitress returned with a tray, set down a slip of paper folded behind glass, and placed it gently before him. Inside the simple frame was the note that had started it all. The same hurried lines written in pen across linen, "Thank you for seeing me." He reached out and touched the glass, as if the warmth of the moment might rise through it, his chest tightening, his throat refusing to steady. The room around him blurred for a moment, not from the noise or the light, but from the tears that filled his eyes. Tears he did not hide, tears that belonged here more than any words he could have spoken. He let them fall, small dark spots on the polished table, and he did not reach for a napkin to wipe them away. He left them there, on purpose, proof that honesty had weight and that gratitude could break even the hardest restraint. The kitchen door swung open and closed beside him, easy, steady, carrying the voices of people who no longer feared cameras turned toward them. The sound was no longer harsh. It was a heartbeat, a reminder that work, when done clean, needs no disguise. James rose from the table, leaving the frame behind for others to see, not as a secret, but as a testament. This time they had looked, and they had not looked away, and in that choice, everything had changed. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like, and if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.